Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Elwin, are we good? Thank you. So welcome, everybody, to today's exciting session. My name is Nomazulu Mtetwa. I'm the Partnerships and Community Officer at 825, coming from Old Mutual. Before we get into the proceedings of the day, I just want to give some housekeeping rules. Please, can we put our phones on silent? Let's put our phones on silent. And we also have our restrooms into the other corridor. We have the ladies first, just down the corridor, then further down we have the gents. A little bit of a walk, but you'll make it there. And I think that's basically it. We will have a registration form passing around. Please complete the form. I'm curious to know whether we have just hub members here, or did our external guests also make it? Anyone who's not from here? Nice. Anyone else? Anyone from Old Mutual? Not yet. Okay, me. All right, so the rest are our hub members. So thank you so much, guys, for coming through. I hope that this session will be quite insightful. So I'm just going to read out, for the sake of the platitudes and the pleasantries. So just thank you again for coming through today, and we're pleased to be able to welcome those of you who are members of the hub, as well as of course our friends from the US Embassy. So funny enough, according to some technological growth, some say that technological growth necessitates that all stakeholders ensure secure digital infrastructure and cybersecurity. So today we are going to delve into the topic during this lecture with our special guests, who I will not mention the name because that would be Kenneth's or Sizani's duty to introduce. But this, of course, this lecture is brought to you by 825, powered by Old Mutual, in partnership with the US Embassy of Zimbabwe. So we're quite interested in learning about the transformative nature of 5G and as it impacts our businesses, and what benefits we can experience as startups, as entrepreneurs, and of course as corporate businesses. And we're always happy to collaborate with the US Embassy, and we anticipate that we'll have more such sessions which can benefit not only our hub members but our startup community around us. So as we all know, and for the sake of those joining us online, 825 is focused on creating a modern, professional, and energetic work environment to stimulate creativity, productivity of entrepreneurial businesses and their teams. And through the entrepreneurship pillar, Old Mutual works to promote entrepreneurship and build the capacity of these individual enterprises that through increased access to relevant business development services, including access to finance. You will have noted when we had our Global Money Week event, where we brought in our team from Old Mutual Finance and Old Mutual Securities. And of course, our value proposition to SMEs includes an ecosystem that supports sustainable entrepreneurship through access to advice, training programs such as these ones, and product services and digital content. So we aim to build 825 through 825 the resilience of startups, and because we recognize their tenacity and their creativity, and we want to work with you as we equip you accordingly. So please do enjoy the session. Sit back and relax. I would like to call Sizani Weza from the US Embassy to come and introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noma. My name is Sizani Weza, and I'm the Established Opinion Leaders Specialist at the US Embassy. I work with mainly civic society and any established opinion leaders that work to meet our goals. And our goals in this instance is trying to build a a secure network. I think that's the goal of the US government. But for us to get to that secure network, we are learning more about 5G as one of the backbones of that industrial internet where innovations are going to come in. So we are very excited to be partnering 8 to 5 in this discussion with innovators. I think the aim today is actually World Telecommunication and Information Society Day. And this is coming at a time when we are celebrating the developments in technology. We know that we had radio, we had internet in the 1960s, later on, and 3G, LTE, and 4G. So we are celebrating these developments in the communications, information and communications industry. So in our programming, we usually benefit from visiting speakers. They come here to interact with experts in the field as well as communities. And one of those experts, they are not they are experts in the industry. So she has been here meeting telcos, regulators, technology schools, and tomorrow she'll be speaking at a symposium on trying to launch Zimbabwe's businesses into the fourth industrial revolution. And we are looking at talking to people in medtech, edutech, fintech, that is the banking sector, as well as the telecommunications sector. So briefly about Evanna, she runs a company called Omelas, which she founded. It's an artificial intelligence and machine learning company. And she's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where she focuses mainly on emerging technologies with a specialization on artificial intelligence and 5G. So briefly, that's what Evanna is, and she will talk briefly about 5G, just as an introduction, and we lead the discussion into looking at how innovations can spare this, because 5G is useless without your innovations. And that's why we want the banking sector to come in. That's why we want agriculture sector, the mining sectors to come in. Because right now, as we speak, most Zimbabweans use WhatsApp, Facebook, and Twitter for their internet. That's okay with 3G, that's okay with 2G, that's okay with maybe 4G. But when you go into those innovations where you are talking about Internet of Things, you are talking about banking online, not using your USSD to do zip it and stuff like that, you will need faster internet with low latency. So she'll give us a background about 5G and basically what it is, and then we lead into discussions about that. Thanks a lot. Evanna, I think I'll hand over to you.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I know that all of you are busy, so definitely appreciate the commitment. So before I start on what 5G actually is, I just want to ask you 2 sets of questions. Number 1, how many of you here are tech entrepreneurs or work in tech? Okay. What do you do?
Using artificial intelligence to handle accurate marking, score grading, clear suggestions based on detailed analytics. So in layman terms, what we do is when the student is taking an exam, we keep track of all the questions that are not doing well, and then we classify them into chapters. And then we give them like a detailed report on the areas they need to improve.
Awesome.
They can send it to a teacher or something like that. And also schools can also adopt the technology to pursue personalized learning based on the students' needs.
So it's I'm assuming it's a web dashboard and an app, maybe?
Yeah, it's a web dashboard.
The web
So, yeah.
dashboard. Okay. Anyone else? App developers here? Anyone training their own algorithms? Using Chat GTP, maybe? Yeah? Okay, cool. Good. All right, second set of questions. How many of you think that you have used 5G speed in Zimbabwe? No. What about 4G? Yeah? What about LTE? Okay. And then 3G and 2G. Yeah, we've all experienced it. Okay. Okay. So what's the difference right now between 4G and LTE? Speed? Which one is faster? 4G. Okay. Yep. Do you know the threshold for 4G typically by international standards? Right. So 4G basically, so there's a international government body called the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, which is under the UN. And they basically have benchmarks saying you can say that you are doing 4G or using 4G speed when it's above a certain mega or Mbp per second. So typically that benchmark is 100. And so what you're currently working on right now is you're looking at the broadband, right? And the reason why I'm asking about 4G is because we've heard some things about how sometimes it says on your phone that you have 4G, but sometimes you don't really actually have 4G speed. And so that's something that we'll come back to a little bit later. But when it comes to 5G, so the G stands for generation, so it's just the 5th generation of technology. We're talking about a spectrum, right? And so from this picture, what you see is you have these low frequency cells, which is 700 megahertz. So anything below 700 megahertz on the broadband is considered 4G. Between the 700 megahertz all the way up to here, which is, this one stops at 26 gigahertz, it's considered 5G. But really, when we're talking about 5G, it stops somewhere here, which is at 6. And that is because anything above 6 is typically reserved for national security. So think about the military, your emergency services, because they can't have other clogging up the broadband when they're supposed to be operating, right? So when we're talking about for consumers, we're really talking about from the 700 to 6. So why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because a lot of these things that you see here are applications of 5G that makes it possible. So on the very low end, if you're having a very large event, you have thousands of users. They're all taking videos, they're WhatsApping each other videos, they're putting it up online, they might be streaming something else, right? That takes up a lot of capacity. And so and that also takes up, you need the speed to be able for me to send a video to someone else. And so that's typically at the low frequency. And then you have your vehicle communications and transport infrastructure. So this is where, a technology like the education technology that he just mentioned will fall under. And that's also where we're talking about your Teslas, your driverless cars that needs to be on the road because they need to be communicating with their software, right? You get to smart cities, which is something that I'm sure you guys have heard about, and then IoT devices, right? So if I want commercially, let's say that I am a agricultural company and I have a gigantic chicken farm. I'm making it up right now. And I have sensors telling me, the temperature of the farm, I have videos in there where I can look at the chickens and make sure that they're not fighting. I don't know anything about agriculture. I'm literally making it up. And I also also have an automated grain system which feeds them automatically 3 times a day, and that's set, right? I need to be able to access that in the US or in other parts of Zimbabwe or in South Africa when I'm not there, right? And okay, everything is good, or like, no. And so I need to get someone to go to the farm and break up the chicken, all of that, right? That requires a lot more of these high frequency cells for the broadband, right? So the more data that it's churning out, the faster it goes. And so this is basically showing sort of the trade-off. So at the very bottom, you see the low bands. So the low bands are what we consider as the sub 1. So if you extend this down, right? So then you have your 4Gs here, your LTE, your 3G, and your 2G, right? The good thing about, and then as you're going up, you have your mid-band, which is between 1 gigahertz to 2.6. So that's mid-band tier 1. And then mid-band tier 2 is 3.5 to 6. And then your high band is anything above 6. So this is just the industry standard that every single country is currently using. Okay. So you can see the trade-offs that you're currently making, right? Because at the very low band, you can actually go pretty wide geographically. And this is the reason why in rural places, you see that they only have access to 2G, right? The higher up you go, the less coverage you essentially have, and the more barriers you have to encounter. So if you actually have seen Econet's 5G towers, they're significantly taller than the other towers. And that's just because as they're going up, right, they have to be able to actually connect to the other cell towers. And it's also a lot harder to have them in rural places because it would have to work through mountains and lakes and altitude and all of these things. And 5G, frankly, is not very conducive to that. However, the trade-off here is that with 5G, you have much, much lower latency. So you're not going to be buffering as much. If I send something to another friend of mine on WhatsApp, a video, it's not going to take them forever to retrieve that video or that file, right? So it's lower latency, and then the capacity also gets significantly higher, right? So the problem with 4G, and we've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, whenever we get 4G, we actually have fewer bars. And then when we reconnect our phone to the 3G, our bars go up or increase. And that's because it's a capacity issue. So the higher you go up on the spectrum, this is the spectrum broadband, the more capacity you have. Okay. So why is this relevant is the ITU, they basically allocate a certain amount of spectrum for every country. Right? So Zimbabwe has spectrum, South Africa has its own quota, and what the regulatory government bodies are supposed to do, they're supposed to bid on the spectrum. And this is what they've done with 4G, 3G, and 2G, right? With 5G, POTRAS is supposed to say, hey, I have sub 1 and all the way up to 3.5, for example. I have a certain amount I'm allocated. Econet, Tel1, please come and bid on this. So then they all go back and they do their math on their business model and make sure that it's, let's just say that Tel1 bids 8 out of 20. Econet bids 3 out of 20, right? So then they're looking at this and they're like, okay, well, we're going to give this much to Econet, we're going to give this much to another player, etc. That's what they're supposed to do. POTRAS hasn't done it yet, which is the reason why you don't have 5G. Econet tried 5G, right, in certain places, including CBD, I think the affluent areas and the airport. But they actually ran that test on an unofficial license, which is also the reason why they're hesitant and why a lot of telcos here are hesitant on investing more in 5G, because they don't want to make all this investment. And we're going to go over why 5G, why there are limitations to 5G, without having the regulatory body coming out saying, this is what you have to do. Because the worst thing is to spend millions of dollars on new hardware, and then Potras says something, and then they're like, oh, well, we just wasted $10 million. Right? That's not great for a company. You're not expected to understand this unless you work in telecom. But the reason why I'm showing you this is to show you how much hardware we have to buy for 5G. Okay. So this is the traditional 5G model. It's a dedicated hardware. You have your remote radio and then your baseband unit. So probably the most prominent thing that you see are the towers themselves. But right next to the towers, you also have this like little, it's almost like a server room, like the one that you have here. And then, but each of the servers are also dedicated. So if you're buying a vendor like Ericsson, your 4G and your 5G hardware is actually exactly the same. It's just the software that's different. But if you're buying Huawei, if you're buying ZTE, you have to buy completely new hardware on top of building that giant base tower. So it is actually very, very expensive. And so for a lot of telcos, they're thinking, well, should I be spending this much money on 5G infrastructure, or should I be spending that money on strengthening my 2G or working on the 4G and making it more stable, right? So it's a trade-off. There are other versions of 5G, which is using cloud, so that you don't actually have to spend that much money on hardware. So that is a possibility, and so that's what these things are. Cloud is a little bit of a controversial topic here in Zimbabwe because, well, when you don't have power a lot of the times and then your generator is no longer working, like, what do you do, right? So that is another thing that a lot of the telco industry players have to consider, which is, sure, yeah, I can put it on cloud, but if my cloud isn't working 4 hours out of the 24 even, what does that mean for my customers, right? All right. Any questions so far on what 5G is? Yes. I think you need a mic, maybe? There you go.
One, okay. So did you say the international body will give an allocation to Zimbabwe for the 5G?
To every country.
Okay. So for example, let's say we're given 10. So then it's given to Potras, and then Potras then says come and bid. So maybe let's say we've got 3 players, one gets 4, one gets 3, one gets 3. Okay. So what happens if Potras decides 5G is from the devil?
Because 5G causes COVID and cancer?
Yes. What if?
We're going to talk about that later.
Is it then possible to, can they just bypass and use cloud instead of everything else?
No, because you still need a spectrum.
Okay.
So that's the reason why, we talking to the regulators and making sure that they understand what 5G is also really important, because ultimately they can just say, no, I don't want to put out an auction for the spectrum. I'd rather just leave the spectrum unallocated and all of you guys have to use 4G.
Okay. That's bad news.
Yes.
Services like Starlink, where do they fit in that spectrum band?
Great question. So satellites, not just only Starlink, but there are other commercial players. Huawei has its own satellites. They have thousands of them. So it's a way to sort of bypass this entire system, which is the reason why Starlink became very popular, because in a lot of places where either the government has shut down the telcos, right? So think about in places like Iran, if you want to bypass the government censorship, you can use satellites to do that. Same thing in Ukraine. If there's a war, most likely the base towers are going to be destroyed. And so how will people communicate? They will be using Starlink. Unfortunately, right now, so there are a few smaller players actually in Zimbabwe that rent out satellite so that they can offer connectivity. It is really expensive though. I know that Starlink is working in certain countries like Rwanda and Nigeria on decreasing their price. And here, yeah. But right, I think that's just like, they're just starting that. But it's certainly a way to bypass this. And then it depends on how much you want to pay, right? If you want to pay, if you have a lot of money, you can pay for very high speed on satellites, but it's ridiculously expensive. Okay. So, how do I explain it? Okay. So before I explain that, let me explain something else first. Vendor lock-in, right? So right now, when you're talking about your traditional model of 5G, typically, if one component of the hardware, so if you have to buy 6 hardware, I'm making up the number, and one of them is Huawei, you have to use Huawei for everything else, which means that Huawei can give you the first component for free. Second one, charge you a bit. And then they know at this point that you're locked in to them because Ericsson's not going to work, right? ZTE is not going to work with Huawei. So then they can just charge you an insane amount for everything else, which they have done. The reason why people want to get away from that model is because they want to make sure that their equipment is interoperable. So before I explain the cloud stuff, there's the Open RAN first. So Open RAN basically is open source. They basically, all the players came together and they said, you know what? In order to increase the adoption of 5G, we can't make it so that you're locked in. And so we're going to use the same interoperable protocols so that you can mix and match. So this is where you see you have the hardware, the white box hardware, and then you have the general purpose, right? And then another general hardware that you have in the traditional model. Virtual RAM, basically what it's saying is, hey, instead of having 3 pieces of hardware, we're going to turn these 2 into cloud. So instead of using a distributed unit that is a hardware, this one is just using your cloud. So it can be any sort of cloud that you want, and that will decrease the price. Once again, the trade-off there is you need a constant supply of power. So the best comparison I have is if you think about your regular car, right? It's a car. It has all the hardware components to it, brakes, etc. But then you also have like Tesla cars, right? Where they actually have significantly fewer number of parts because they have a lot more hardware, right? So inside a Tesla, for example, you don't have certain like mechanism for like, you don't have the physical like the manual controls because everything is done on software. So that decreases the price of hardware. Of course, Teslas are expensive because the software is expensive. But if you can actually think about the less hardware that we have, the potential for that to go down because software is always going to, it can be cheaper. Most of the time it is cheaper than hardware unless you have a monopoly on software, right? Any other questions? Okay. All right, so the adoption of AI, of 5G, sorry. So why is that important, right? Is because investment in 5G, it takes years. Not only are we talking about the financing behind it, but just building up the base system, training your engineers, because you need engineers who are able to work in 5G. That takes years. And the reason why there are players who, might be saying, look, I don't know if Zimbabwe is ready for 5G because we barely have 4G. So why are we doing 5G, right? But the problem is once it's adopted even just by a little bit, there's a huge acceleration of that adoption curve. So let's just talk about, so this is a chart of mobile subscriptions by region. These are all split by regions of the world. So you have India, the Middle East and Africa, Southeast Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. For those in the back, the orange, right, is basically showing 5G. The green is LTE and 4G. And then the dark green is 2G/3G. And then so we're not gonna, let's just take that one out for now. And then for 2G, it's the blue. And then anything below that, okay? So these two bars that I am pointing at, this one is from 2019 in North America. So in North America in 2019, you see like a little bit of 5G, right? Everything else, 91% is 4G. And then below here, you have a little bit of 3G and 2G. So this is 2019. In 2025, you see this little bit of orange getting dramatically, or it's dramatically increases, right, to 74%. Because that is how quick the adoption is, right? And then the rest of it is 4G, and no one's supporting 2G and 3G. And so, by the way, just because you have 5G, it doesn't mean that you can't run your 4G, 3G, 2G. But you have to make that financial decision of, do I spend my money on maintaining 2G when I could be spending that money on 5G? And that's what telcos have to think about. Let's look. Right. So in Middle East and Africa in 2019, there's no orange, so there's no 5G. You have 17% of 4G, but most of it is still on 3G, which is the purple, and 43% is at 2G, which I think tracks for Zimbabwe, right? In 2025, that number is supposed to increase to 7% for 5G, and then 39% for 4G, which is the biggest chunk, actually, compared to 3G and then 2G. So you can see that once 5G starts to be rolled out, people might be a little bit reluctant, and then it kind of just, it grows like a hockey stick, essentially, J curve, whatever you want to call it. All right, and so because we're still in the first section of this, which is still on what there is a security aspect to it. As you can imagine, when you're running a bunch of hardware and software on top of each other, there are a lot of the vulnerabilities from a cybersecurity aspect, right? And then there's also that surveillance or the vendor security. So how do we know Huawei or any one of the vendors out there, they do not pose a security risk, that they have installed a backdoor so that their government can essentially suck in all your data and then be able to view that data. And this is where we need regulatory frameworks on data privacy and cyber and security concerns. And right now, telcos don't have any, they don't have any guidance on 5G when it comes to the security of people's data and then the privacy and how do we actually deal with all of it. So that's something else that POTRAS probably should work on. All right. Any questions on the first section? What is 5G? I am going to, okay, so the next sort of section, right? And I love to have a conversation with you because I am not an expert in Zimbabwe. Everything I just learned, I learned it in the past 3 days. I got here on Sunday. And so you guys are the right people to think about, should Zimbabwe think about 5G? And if so, which sector, right? And so before that, I am going to just give you a couple of the factors to consider. One is digital divide. We know that 2G barely exists right now in rural Zimbabwe. So despite the fact that the government has a program called the Universal Access Fund, and that is to increase connectivity in whole of country, even in places where telcos, it doesn't really make much sense financially for them to be there. But the government's essentially subsidizing that, right? So if we actually implement 5G for the consumer market, what does this mean for the digital divide? Right? Should we actually think about 5G, this is the second factor, as a blanket network for everyone? Or should we think about it in terms of us, individual consumers, right? Critical sectors like mining, agriculture, people working in AI who need 5G, but it doesn't have to be a mass market because they can ask for a private 5G network specifically for their business, right? Or should we actually, consider, well, maybe the university should also get theirs because they're doing research and development. They have high-tech computer. They're trying to create these algorithms, all of that, which requires 5G, right? And then there's also sort of your value add services, which is, well, if the consumers are driving the demand saying, hey, it would be awesome if I can use my phone through an app and do banking transactions, right? Or doing any of the other services. And what you don't want to happen is you don't want to get online to do banking and then your speed drops, your signal drops, and you're like, I don't know if my $300 just got deposited, or maybe I just lost it, right? So thinking through all of those things. And then the third is the revenue model. Can we actually start thinking about potentially other players that we can bring into the 5G ecosystem so that it's actually more affordable, so that the consumers, right, don't have to pay extra for 5G. But then if you're a telco and you're like, I have to pay for my base stations, I got to pay for all this hardware, where am I going to get my credit from? They certainly don't want to be paying 35 to 50% interest rate by going to any of the banks in the country. So maybe that's when we should reach out to the African Development Bank, and we should be leveraging corporates, right, to get their sponsorship as well. Like, who else can we actually bring to the table? And then you have the regulatory framework, which is right now, it seems like everyone's sort of waiting to see what POTRAS is going to do in terms of offering the licenses and the spectrum. And so even if you're Econet, and let's just say we're cynical about why they decide to do 5G, okay? Let's just take the cynical perspective that they did it for marketing, right? Let's just say that. But even then, they're sort of playing with a little bit of, fire because they are running on unofficial licenses. So is there an incentive to make their 5G hotspots better? Is there incentive to continue to do a pilot and advance? From a business perspective, it might not be for them. So maybe they're going to pause. But if everyone thinks that way and everyone just waiting for the government, what does that actually mean for Zimbabwe? Right. Any thoughts, comments? Yes. I think you have to take a mic.
I think in the context of Zimbabwe, we should look into bringing other players because right now 4G barely works. most of the times when you're on 4G, like for 4 minutes, the next minute you're on 2G. So I think bringing other reliable players would really work. Yeah.
So who else would you want to bring into the ecosystem? Like more Starlink-like companies where?
I think most Starlink companies and maybe other competitors from other countries, maybe from South Africa, that have proven to be working and that they're reliable, something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. For the Zimbabwean market, we are a bit price sensitive. So maybe the first question I would pose is it going to change the price maybe for our data? Because already as it is,
It's
and
expensive.
specifically the example you're giving has been struggling for the past 2 weeks. I don't know what's happening at Econet. If you are able to answer that, please help us in that area.
What we have heard is that the government puts a regulation on how much they can charge the consumers. They have to approve any increases.
So
I don't know if that's actually, I don't know if that's true.
are
yeah.
we safe to say Econet is acting out?
This is on the record. I have no comment on that.
Well, will 5G increase? Will 5G increase the cost of data? That's my concern.
I'm pretty sure that every telco player, whether it's a mobile operator or fixed point or whoever it is, they know how price sensitive the consumers are. And this is where they get stuck, right? Because they want to do 5G. But then if they can't pass on the price to the consumer, then how are they going to finance this? Which is also the reason why some of them have taken, they're sort of in this debt trap by vendors, because they're like, oh, well, I'll just deal with that problem down the road. And then now that they're at down the road and they're like, oh crap, we can't really do more investment. So I think they know that, which is another reason why other players have not gotten into the 5G game. Yes.
Thank you. I think for 5G in Zimbabwe, with where we are right now, it would make more sense not for the mass market, but only for the specific industries or institutions that really require to have the technology, so that it will at the end of the day benefit everyone else. Because even if we have 5G for the mass market, are they really going to use it? Do they really need the technology for the day-to-day internet usage? Thank you.
Actually, you bring up a good point that I did not touch on, and I should have. How many of you here have an iPhone 12 and above? Yeah. Okay. Everyone else, are you using Androids like Samsung's? Okay. So good news for those with iPhone 12 and above, you can access 5G. Anyone else, even on Samsungs that are like S20 and above? Meh, that sucks for you. Even if you have a phone that is 5G capable, you can't access it because Samsung has not gotten the certificates from POTRAS. So that it's another problem. 5G. Only out of these 30,000, only 2,500 of them are mobile devices. They're all Apple phones, right? So they're in the process of negotiating with Samsung right now. If you have a Huawei phone, I think there are certain models where it's already compatible, but with Samsung's, you can't access it. So, I mean, I have a flip phone from Samsung and I can't access 5G here.
I just wanted to add on that the government or even institutions, private institutions, they should work on stimulating the demand for 5G. Because even if we have increased number of base stations for 5G, it would make no sense because the demand side is still low.
All right, that's a good point. How do you think the ecosystem can do that? Are you talking about services, more like apps. I don't know, get more people to watch TikTok videos.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm wondering, and I'm hoping we might also talk about the elephant in the room, right? The big USA,
The what? I'm sorry.
America itself, and what I perceive within the context of telecommunications is this monopoly, or the idea of a hegemony of who controls what. And I'm wondering what you see in regards to that in relative to countries weak as Zimbabwe is, in terms of how it could negotiate its access to this, whilst also keeping clear of the geopolitics. Because I hear you've been talking a lot in your friends, you use Hawaii a lot, which I understand is involved within the geopolitics and telepolitics of 5G and these networks.
Yeah, so I haven't mentioned any American company because the only American 5G player there is right now is Cisco, and that's not really their business. So America doesn't really have, like, American companies just are not in the 5G game. So when we're talking about the big vendors, we're talking about Huawei, ZTE, Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung, and Rakuten to a certain extent. But that's it. And none of them is American. What I think you're getting at is this geopolitical fight between the US and China, right? That's what you're referring to. So I think this is when typically they like me to say that I am here as an individual American. I do not represent the views of the US Embassy, nor the State Department, or the entire US government. Okay, so now that's out of the way. So 5G, so yeah, so both sides are basically saying, so the US has banned Huawei and ZTE, Hikvision, and another camera company, Dahua, from the majority of basically a lot of the stuff that the US government funds, and also within the US. And the reason why they say that is because they're saying that these companies are putting backdoors on their technology, so that the Chinese government can have access to all the data, including any of the personal information out there. And then they can use that to target somebody that they don't like, right? All these Chinese companies have basically denied it, even though I think you can find proof that they have. They're online. You can make your own, you can read them, make your own judgment. I'm not going to get into that fight, mainly because I'm not technical enough to understand all the nitty gritty. And at the same time, China is also saying that there are certain technology platforms that the US has that they're also doing the same thing, right? And some of that's from the Snowden leak from a long time ago, that the US is surveilling platforms and people all around the world, right? So that is definitely one of the reasons why 5G is very sensitive. And a lot of the telcos are caught in the middle because they understand that there's a security issue and then there's a funding issue, because a lot of the Chinese companies are subsidized by their state-owned enterprises, right? They're subsidized by the government. And so they can offer countries in Africa with very, very cheap debt, where it looks like it's very cheap, but then your debt kind of exponentially grows. I think it's pretty objective fact that there are players in Zimbabwe, when you talk to them privately, they will talk about their Chinese debt problem. Some of them might even talk about it openly, right? And so they're just very cautious about that. But at the same time, you have these Western companies like Ericsson, Nokia, and then Samsung, which is from South Korea. Rakuten is Japanese. Because they're not subsidized by their governments, they're expensive. They're expensive from the get-go. It's not like they're expensive 3 years in. They're just expensive. So how do you make that play? And this is where, when we're talking about open RAN and virtual RAN, it's sort of like another way for the telcos to kind of get around that problem, because telcos are businesses at the end of the day, and they have to balance the geopolitical game. I don't envy them in that position.
Okay. I just want to add something on how to enable more people to be able to use the networks or 5G. Like if you look at Zimbabwe in particular, for mobile operators, for every dollar, 23% it goes to taxes. So the first point to address is the issue of the governance and access. I think the UN now regards internet access as a human right. Is that it?
You're talking about the UN fundamental rights, human
Yes.
rights. Yeah. So there has been a huge discussion about adding it's the access to the internet
Okay.
that they want to put as a human right. I'm not sure if it passed or not, but I think access to the internet is a little bit different from high speed 5G, right? Because you can still get to the internet on 3G or 4G.
Yeah. And number two is on the state of our economy, which is mostly informal sector. So there's need to find ways to integrate the informal sector in terms of access, fintech, and for them to move their business or whatever they do to the digital economy or e-commerce. As per Zimstat publications, the growing sector in Zim are a retail sector and ICT, and there's a lot of equipment which is still outdated. So there's a lot which might need to be done for retail sector so that at least the telecoms have more revenue. That's my input.
So my question to all of you, right, because I think you raised some good points, is how did Zimbabwe go from SMS to WhatsApp? Because if we were having this conversation 7 years ago, and I was said, yeah, the majority of Zimbabweans now are using a mobile app called WhatsApp, right? You would have looked at me like, there's no way. Like, you need better devices and you need data, and data is expensive. So how does Zimbabwe go from SMS to WhatsApp so quickly? And can we take that lesson and apply it to looking at 5G? It's not a question just for you. I don't know why I'm just looking at you. I'm looking at all of you. Can we take the mic?
From what I remember, it was cheaper in the long run. Text, the whole bundle issue in terms of WhatsApp made it cheaper, and then quick text and all that. Text had issues to do with higher costs, and then there were fewer on the same dollar. And then your WhatsApp bundle, the message that they preached was you could send maybe 100 times what you could send using text. So it then zeroed down to cost.
Do you think, though, there is also a network effect? Because if you think about it, right, it's actually very similar to 5G. You can buy a brick Nokia phone, your very dumb Nokia phone, right, for I don't know how much here. Let's say $10. In order to use WhatsApp, you still need a feature phone to download the app. So you still need to upgrade. So you still need that hardware, the cost in getting a better hardware, right? Which is almost the same as like, you need to go from an iPhone 11 to an iPhone 12 in order to, and so what an iPhone 12 now is like more than $1,000, let's just say $1,000, right? So how do people think about that when it came to WhatsApp? And also second is the culture of going from just calling people to texting. Like what drove that? Maybe it's because if they want to talk to their son or daughter in Harare and they're in rural Zimbabwe, they realize that they kind of have to have a phone with WhatsApp.
Okay.
Right? So like, can we use some of that for 5G?
So to answer the question where you're moving from calling to texting, you could only call one person at a time. Then you could text multiple people at the same time. Then WhatsApp, you could text groups at the same time. So just to take you back a bit, I just want to clearly understand from a layman's point the 5G. So this has to do with, let's say I have a dog at home, then it went out, and then I want it back in, and then from my phone I can open the gate for it to enter back in, and then close the door, and then turn off the heaters and all that.
Yes.
So I think.
So that's like that's a commercial use. Yes.
So
you can do that on 4G, but it just might get stuck.
Yeah.
It might be buffering for a long time.
And then for people with iPhones 12 and above, we are still messaging the same people. We are still in the same groups. We are still talking to the same people and doing basically the same thing, isn't? But just for $1,400 and for $100 for me.
Yeah, but if you want to, I don't know, start streaming TV shows, you definitely need 5G for that. Like streaming on 4G is terrible. It's choppy, like it's all pixelated, and you're waiting, and
No, it isn't. There are now sites like Kujara, if you know of it, or number of sites where it's smoothless. It's like you're watching a downloaded movie on 4G. Of course, Econet for now is failing, but it used to happen on 4G. So I'm thinking there are specifically people like the mining industry, the examples you were giving. We can start there, and then we take it from there, and then maybe when we'll have buses or a whole lot of infrastructure, or maybe the CBD that's needing this 5G to say, I can order anything from my phone, and then from like WeChat, the way WeChat operates, where your whole life is there. Maybe then it maybe SASAI could improve.
Yeah.
We will need 5G on SASAI.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking.
I mean, so I think the buses is actually a very good example of sort of when you need 5G and when you don't, right? So imagine if you're the city of Harare and you're like, I want to make sure that there's a sensor on every single bus and at every single bus stop, the real-time tracking. You can see exactly when the bus is going to come, right? To run all that data on the back end for the city, you need 5G for that because they're dealing with millions of data points. But you as a consumer, you can use your 3G phone because they're going to have a SMS or USSD where you can just go, okay, I want to see when my bus number nine is going to arrive, right? You're still interacting with their interface, and even if they do have an app, it probably will work on 4G, right? But if you're using their SMS version, so for you, the consumer, you don't need 5G. But for the government to provide you with that service of real life tracking of buses, they need to have that. So I think your point is very well taken, which is that maybe for the consumers, might not be something that you need immediately, but for corporations and maybe the government, they do need that.
Thanks. So my side, it's more of a contribution than a question. So you asked about WhatsApp. What did we do right on WhatsApp for it to be number one, there are actually two things that caused WhatsApp in Zim. Number one, it was the issue of cost. So for you to send an SMS, just to put into context, it may cost you between maybe 3 to 4 cents USD. And then for WhatsApp, it was way cheaper for that. And then the other thing was the issue of voice calls. When you bought airtime for, the cheapest is like $1, it would take you maybe for 4 minutes of calling, and WhatsApp would take you way longer than that. So it was the issue of cost. And then the second one was the issue of the network effect you're talking about. I see him with WhatsApp. Obviously, for me to join what they're doing, I then get into that. So it was the issue of cost and network effect. And then for 5G adoption, the way I would say this from the research that I've done, it's more of a tier layered problem that we have to solve. Number one, I would say maybe let's start with the infrastructure. Right now in Zim, there's about maybe 13, 14 million people, and only about 5 million on the internet. That's about 30%. So for that 30%, the major problem that we have is, maybe let me give you a story. For example, internet. For us to have fiber, companies like Amazon, companies like Facebook, companies like Google Cloud, if I'm not mistaken, they invested in the local telcos for them to lay the fiber. So for 5G, maybe we may need some of those companies to come, but the problem now is maybe on the infrastructure that I would say is the maybe power. Because I know maybe 60 to 70% of the base stations, they run on Tesla Powerwalls, and they can only last you maybe for about 8 hours maximum. So if we don't have power for more than 8 hours, those base stations shut down, and then we are congested on the other ones. That then means the 4G sucks. So without solving maybe the power problem, which is the core, it may be difficult to then maybe make people enjoy 4G, then to transition 5G. And then the last one would be the issue of use cases. In Zim, it's a bit difficult to find use cases for things like IoT, which is a major thing for 5G, or maybe we can use it in agriculture because we are an agricultural based country. Maybe that's where it will be most useful. So use cases like surgical robotics, things like IoT, they are not really yet prevalent in Zim. So yeah, that's just for your notes. Thanks.
Yeah, those are great points. Any other comments? Yes, back there.
Okay, for Zim, another major thing for adoption or innovation or what leads to leapfrogging in technology is the diaspora. They determine the pace of innovation. Like another move from SMS to WhatsApp was that with SMS, it was more like easier to communicate with people in Zimbabwe. But as people moved to other countries and wanted to stay in touch with their families, the diaspora is what also led to more use of WhatsApp, and even when people would come here home, they would no longer need to pay a lot of money for roaming for their foreign line. And number two is the issue on payments. To make it easier for people to move from cash to fintech or e-commerce, you need faster payments. The reason why the informal sector ends up opting to use more of cash is the issue of speed. Imagine it, Mbare, there are like 30 trucks by 5 a.m. There are also another 30 trucks waiting to offload agricultural produce. So with GSM POS machines, you can't be waiting to make payments for 5 minutes. So the issue of time convenience and innovating around diaspora and the informal sector can also push even the telcos or government to consider lowering the taxes, which are barriers to entry for the telcos. Thank you.
Yeah, so I know that there are discussions right now between the telcos and the taxes that you're talking about. A lot of that was put on because of COVID. So obviously now that COVID is almost done, the telcos want to actually get rid of those tariffs because those tariffs are also very punishing on them as well. And then on fintech, I'm just curious too, right? Like you talk about sort of the speed of payment, but isn't it also just trust in banks that would also have to increase first? Yeah.
I think it's not trust. I think it's not trust in banks, but trust in the currency first that we have to.
Trust in the currency,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so I know, as Sidani was saying in his remarks, tomorrow we're actually gathering together people from like senior executives from different industries that could be impacted by 5G, but also including banks and the regulators, et cetera, just to make sure that like they understand enough about 5G so that they can, because a lot of the limitations that you have brought up, they're structural, right? They're societal issues that need to be fixed. And so now it's saying, okay, everyone else around the world is looking at 5G, but Zimbabwe can't really get to the 5G for the mass market. Obviously, I'm not talking about businesses here, but for the mass market, because all these other issues need to be addressed first in order for that to roll out. And do you really want Zimbabwe to be last? Because it also means that Zimbabwe is not in the conversation when nations get together and they're talking about the standards of 5G. And now the conversation is, what do we do with 6G? Right. So if Zimbabwe wants to have a voice in that on the international stage, they have to first think about these issues. And that's what we're hoping, that we'll have this ecosystem conversation tomorrow.
So there's a comment from our live viewer. His name is Jonathan Makomo. He says, for 5G to take effect in Zimbabwe, we will always come to the issue of cost. The government must work hand in hand with private players to subsidize cost of 5G in Zimbabwe. That's a comment from our online viewer.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm wondering, I'm assuming you hang around Silicon Valley. So what does it really take to get Starlink, like to talk to Musk to bring his stuff here? So that's the front end of the question. And then on the back end, I'm wondering, since you're having that meeting tomorrow, can you just suggest to them, for like Econet to talk to Elon Musk and then bring it here? And then if Portas is gonna then say yes, they can then say yes. Maybe they're gonna say yes after 10 years. But in the meantime, we have access. So you can suggest tomorrow in that meeting, please.
Sure, yeah. To answer your first question, the snarky part of me is like, I think Elon Musk is too busy with Twitter right now. Moving on.
Oh, another comment from Jonathan. He says the infrastructure is costly and maintenance is costly. Operational costs are also costly. Layman in Zimbabwe looks at cost before functionality. Heavily subsidized, the uptake is easy.
Okay.
Just to also add on the comment from Jonathan, as he said, the tax is quite high that these local service providers have to pay is just too high. 23% is a lot. So maybe if the government can lower their tax, maybe to less than 10%, it will also help these companies in actually lowering their costs. Understand 5G is all about is mainly about speed, right?
It's about speed and capacity.
Speed and capacity, right? I think here in Zimbabwe, the challenge, as you mentioned there, you mentioned a lot of industries that actually need this 5G. Us here in this hub, I think we are on fiber, of which here is actually 4G. It's a shared circuit. Right now, the speed goes to less than 10 megabytes per second,
Mhm.
of which when it's after hours, after 6 o'clock, it actually goes way up to over 35 megabytes per second. So with this 5G, it's all about capacity. Fiber is also all about capacity. So I think for this to actually be rolled out, the government should also take part with these local service providers in actually funding them with these machines or with the equipment so that everyone else is capacitated. I understand it's actually quite expensive,
Yep.
but here in the CBD, us here as tech people, we actually need 5G. We actually need the speed that comes with 5G. Because in some instances, it's actually difficult to load a web page. It's instead of it taking me less than 3 seconds, it actually can take over 15 seconds or probably 30 seconds. So I think 5G should be rolled out mainly in the CBD, where us as tech people, where many businesses converge and do transactions inside. And as for the financial sector, I understand that the ATMs, the mobile banking apps, all of those things, right? In some instances, you might find it a bit challenging. Like you said, that you're making an online payment and then later on the network is down. You don't know if the network is down, but even if your network is up and running, but that banking's service is actually just gone down, right? So these banks need consistent internet connection that come, and also the speed that comes with that 5G. Because 5G is not just only wireless, it's also
Fixed line, yeah.
yeah, that's also hardware.
Yes.
So I think everything needs also to be tied there. In some instances, even at ATMs, you might find it that you check out, you actually cash withdraws some money, but for you to check, even if you check on the app, the amount of money may not yet be deducted. It takes some seconds, whereas it needs to be automated
Yep.
to less than a second. So everything else has to be tied there. All the banking sectors need this, us also as consumers of all the things that are there in this country. We also need that technology. So I think everyone else needs it. They just only need a place where they can actually test run it and use it fairly. Thank you.
Those are all very good comments. I think we're going to wrap up now. If you have any other questions, you can talk to me afterwards. But thank you so much. My goal here is to definitely just help you understand what 5G is so that you can decide what we need to do in order to foster a 5G ecosystem here in Zimbabwe, and who you need to talk to. Maybe you have to talk to the banks, you need to talk to POCHAs or the government, etc. So thank you for your participation.
Thank you so much, Evanna and team, for coming through. And I'm pretty sure that we found this session quite insightful. Do we have any other very, very burning questions, parting shots before Evanna and team leave us? None? Okay, that's fine. Any parting shots, Ken, Suzanne?
No, just to say thank you to 8 to 5 and everyone who came. It's been a scintillating discussion. I'm actually amazed at the amount of knowledge that is here about this. When I visited Econet on Monday, actually, with Evanna, and I was shocked that my phone, an iPhone 11, cannot access 5G. But I've never actually looked for it. But I know that they launched it and these base stations. So it's amazing. And I think for me, after Evanna's presentation, I see a lot of opportunities, and innovation is usually the way to go, which is why Old Mutual and others are working in this space. We need, as consumers, we don't usually want to hear about 5G, 4G, and we want things to work. If it works on my phone, it's good. It's good enough. And if you come to me and say 5G, I was talking to some journalists who were saying, oh, we were at the launch of the base stations when Econet announced its 5G. And the user experience at that time didn't match what they had actually offered. So less buzz about the equipment, but more about what works. But innovators, you have an opportunity. Research is also another area, because we actually don't have data about how much Zimbabwe will benefit from 5G. The projected figures that you get are for other countries. What about Zimbabwe? How much have they recouped from their 3G investment, their 4G investment, LTE investments? How much are they likely to get from 5G? Is it better to actually limit it to corporates rather than a mass product? So all these are issues and opportunities that you as innovators can take advantage of. So on behalf of the public diplomacy section, I'd like to thank you all, and thank Section 8, Nomazulu and team for this scintillating discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And with that, he has given us our vote of thanks. I hope that we've all completed the registration form that's going around. I also just want to extend a thank you for our online viewers who joined us today. And we've also just to say that we've come to the end of our session. And thank you once again for coming through, US Embassy and friends. Thank you so much for coming through. We will pause for, as we start networking, we would also just want to have a photo moment, group shot, and then just another shot with Evanna and team. If that's okay with you, just hang around a bit. I've got a snack, it's nothing big, that is being set up as well. So whilst we take our pictures, they'll set up the snacks for us, okay? Right, thank you so much, eh? Yes, you can. So we'll start with the structured one, and then we can have the ones that you want to have, okay? Depending on her time as well. Okay, all righty.